Hello, everybody, and welcome. I'm really excited to welcome you this evening to Understanding the Zapatista Movement for Liberation and Community Building. My name is Alex Elliott, and I am the Senior Manager of Events and Engagement for the Public Programs Department of California Institute of Integral Studies, which, if you do not know, is a nonprofit university located in San Francisco. I know that we are all joining this online event from different places all over the world, but as a representative of CIIS, I want to take a moment to acknowledge our debt and gratitude to the Ramaytush Ohlone, who are the original peoples and continual caretakers of what is now known as the San Francisco Peninsula. CIIS's campus is located on the traditional unceded lands of the Ramaytush Ohlone, which they call Yelamu. In the Ramaytush Ohlone language, Yelamu identifies both the people and the territory. This acknowledgement is just one very small step towards being in deeper connection and relationship with Indigenous tribes and organizations in our own community. And it doesn't begin to acknowledge all of the native lands, languages, and territories where you are right now or where you live and work every day. While we all gather together right now, getting excited about this event, I really invite you to take a moment to acknowledge the land where you reside and to commit to learn more about the Native communities near you and support their work. If it feels right for you to share in the chat where you're coming from or information about Native communities near you or projects that others can support, please share now. That's a great way for us to help raise awareness and be in community about this. If you're not sure where to get started, we always recommend native-land.ca as a starting resource. Before we get started tonight, I have a few quick tips and troubleshooting items. We are going to be having a live Q&A for anyone who is watching the live stream today. You can submit your questions at any time using our web form, which is linked in the event description just below this video. You can submit anonymously or you can share your name. Our presenters are going to be pulling questions that were submitted on that form after the conversation, and we will try to get through as many as we have time for. We do have automatically generated captions for this event, and you can toggle those on and off using the closed captioning button right in YouTube. Chat is enabled for this event, as you may have noticed, but please note it is not being moderated, and our presenters cannot see the chat. If you choose to participate in chat, please be respectful and avoid language that could be offensive or insensitive to others. Chat is in no way required to participate in this event, and you can turn it off at any time. And we really encourage you to do so if you find that it is negatively impacting your experience in any way. If you're having any issues with your audio or video, we always suggest you start by refreshing the page. And then if you're still having issues, it can really help to adjust your video settings or lower that video quality right within YouTube. Now, let me first introduce our presenters, Zara and Charlotte, and then we will get right to their conversation. Zara Zimbardo is an adjunct interdisciplinary studies faculty in the School of Undergraduate Studies here at CIIS. She is the director, a core facilitator, and curriculum designer with Partners for Collaborative Change, which supports organizations to become more equitable through anti-oppression facilitation and coaching, and supports community-driven climate resilience planning through participatory action research. She co-founded the White Noise Collective, an anti-racist feminist training and resource organization that supports investigation and transformation of patterns common at the intersection of whiteness and gender marginalization. Zara is a longtime body worker, and she is an instructor at McKinnon Body Therapy Center. She's passionate about forms of creative facilitation to cultivate critical thinking skills, make unexamined bias conscious, inspire artistic reflection, deepen somatic awareness, and build alliances across differences. Charlotte Sáenz joins fellow artists, scientists, and people of conscience everywhere to practice other ways of seeing and listening to subjugated wisdom and beauty in our world. Her work questions dominant narratives in our education, seeking to expand sensory awareness and collective knowledge while developing greater socio-ecological health and equity. In her native Mexico, the Their research studies how the Zapatista movement engages across geographies in an ethical, political co-education she calls a seed pedagogics. Among her current collaborative projects is a lexicon drawn from struggles in defense and care of Mother Earth. She is Associate Professor of Interdisciplinary Studies here at CIIS. And now it is my great pleasure to turn it over to Charlotte and Zara.
Good evening. Good
Hi.
evening.
Hi, Zara.
Hi, my very dear friend and colleague. I'm so delighted and grateful to be here with you to get to have this interview conversation about the Zapatista movement and about your research. And it's very special to have this in this setting with public programs who we're such fans of. And I want to start by just acknowledging that there is a long-time connection of over a decade between the Zapatista movement and the California Institute of Integral Studies, in significant part through student and faculty delegations to the Zapatista autonomous territories that you have facilitated, delegations of listening, learning, witnessing, and encounter. And I want to honor the connection between CIIS and between CIIS, the Center for the Indigenous Center of Integral Capacitation or Capacity Building, which has been a host institution to many Zapatista events and encounters that CIIS delegations have attended. So of both of these integral institutions and all of the many meanings of integral, between liberatory theory and courageous action, between body-mind, human more than human, north-south, different ways of being, knowing, thinking, and doing. Just want to honor this connection that's here that we get to really lift up tonight. And we had talked about opening with a piece of a story.
Yeah.
Invite this.
Yeah, I'd love to begin with, well, first, thank you. Thank you for that recognition. And I wanted to begin tonight's conversation with a quote. It's just a fragment from a communique that was published in the Mexican newspaper La Jornada on February 24th, 1998. And it's a fragment of a story that's told by a spokesperson for the Zapatistas. It's called An Inverted Periscope, or Memory Buried Key. And it speaks to the importance of learning from history and of unearthing what has been subjugated, what's been buried underground. And so it goes like this. It says, the greatest gods, the first ones, learned that memory is the key to the future, and that one should care for it like one cares for one's land, one's home, and one's history. So that as an antidote for their amnesia, the very first gods, those who gave birth to the world, made a copy of everything they had created and of everything they knew. That copy they hid underground, so that there would be no confusion with what was above ground, so that under the world's ground, there is another identical world to the one here above ground, with a parallel history to that of the surface. The first world is underground. So that's just a little tantalizing fragment of a much larger communique, but to set the stage for understanding what the Zapatista movement is and some of its poetics and complexity and history.
Thank you. And could you share some context within which to understand this fragment? I mean, there's so much context, so many layers of context to share. But who are the Zapatistas? What is Zapatismo? And what is your connection to it? How did you come to be connected to this movement?
So on January 1st, 1994, some of us might remember, that was the date that the North American Free Trade Agreement went to effect, which basically changed the lives of all peoples in these three countries, changing the way much of our livelihoods, the ways that we exchange goods and services. And this date was also the date of the Zapatista uprising. And this was a group of Mayan peasants rising in arms in the southeastern state of Chiapas, Mexico, which is on the border with Guatemala. And this was strategic because it was to make a point about this free trade agreement, because they knew well that it spelled the end of their sustenance way of living as peasants, who had for millennia farmed what we call the milpa, which is a subsistence plot of corn, squash, beans, and many other crops that are grown in that territory. So this armed uprising lasted for 12 days only of battles with the government before a ceasefire was declared that was really called for by the Mexican people, with massive protests against the government's bombing of folks in Chiapas, and asking for a ceasefire, asking for peace. So the ceasefire came in, but then a lot of the government continued its army offensive and paramilitary offensives in years subsequent. So in some way, the government's aggressions continued with low intensity warfare that took many forms in the decades since. But this is what the Zapatista uprising is about. But it also, the name Zapatista references the Zapatistas of the 1910 revolution. So the Zapatistas of today are not the first ones. They take their name from the leader of the South in 1910 revolution, whose name was Emiliano Zapata. So that is where the name comes from. And the more recent Zapatista uprising was notable to the world. It became a global phenomenon because it was the first internet revolution that we were able to follow in real time, with communiques directly from the movement. And these are communiques that continue till today, and that you can read, anybody can read, translated into various languages on the website. It's called Enlace Zapatista. So it's a very internationalist movement, and from the beginning that caught the world's attention in the way that the movement remained in conversation with other movements around the world, with artists, with scientists, with different parts of Mexican civil society, and also international folks, and then invited the world and folks from civil society, nationally and internationally, to come to their territories to learn more about their movement. And so it's grown into a movement that I'll be referring to as Zapatismo, that is focused on the construction of autonomy. And what this word might not be so familiar to folks in the United States, but here in the US, the closest concept is that of indigenous sovereignty. But autonomy, as the word implies, is a self-naming autonomy, naming of self. It's about self-determination, having the ability to live with dignity, as is our birthright as beings on this planet. And so that is part of what the Zapatistas mean with this slogan that has been shown in many of their large signs in their territories, or in different artworks, which is everything for everyone. The Zapatista autonomy is deeply intertwined with solidarity with others who are oppressed around the world. And this notion of autonomy is at the heart of their resistance. Now, there are various components to this autonomy for the Zapatistas. as a colleague of mine, Omar Jabari Salamanca, says, resistance is an infrastructure, not an event. And so the structures of Zapatista autonomy are composed of various things, such as, well, one, self-governance. And this is done by rotating councils that practice what they call mandar obedeciendo, which is a leading by obeying the people, leaders who obey the people. And these are local, regional structures that are open to restructuring when needed, as they are right now. They have recently released a series of 10 communiques just in this past few weeks that are cluing us into their process of 3 years of consultation of their base communities and a massive restructuring of how they organize themselves. And it's a change from how they have been organized in the past decade or more. And they have told us that this is the result of a long time, of a long time of trial and error and seeing what works and doesn't work. But also, autonomy is made up of solidarity economies, the creation of cooperatives, women's cooperatives in particular. It also has a component of community justice, of no jails, but finding ways to resolve conflicts and do a more transformative restorative justice type model. And then a very different kind of education that is determined not by the state, but by families, the communities themselves, of what they want their children to learn, how they want their children to learn, and a different kind of health, which in this case is an integrative health, integrates traditional herbalist practices of healing that are, of millennial traditions, as well as integrating modern medicine and science. And alongside all of this has been a very in a revolutionary recognition of women's rights and values, not just women, but other genders as well. The Zapatista movement in 1994, and in fact, it was drafted earlier in 1993, came out, their very first revolutionary law was that of women. And that was the first of its kind in revolutionary movements of Latin America and maybe even the world, where this kind of attention was given to women in the middle of doing the revolution itself. It wasn't something that could wait until afterwards. It was something that had to be done right there. So that's a snapshot of who the Zapatistas are and what Zapatismo is. I mean, this is a movement, a political philosophy that has its roots in Marxism, in Latin American traditions of liberation theology, as it's manifested locally in the diocese of Bishop Samuel Ruiz, who's very beloved by local peoples and called Tatik, as well as by very influenced also by regional ancestral cosmologies and practices. So it's part of a long history of indigenous resistance to an ongoing process of global colonization, which just more recently in the late 20th century, we've come to call globalization, but which is really the continuation of an unfinished conquest in this intensified period, especially now of late capitalist extraction. So that's what we're facing now. That's what they're facing now. That's what we're all facing now. Right. Is this global transnational capital coming to scrape the bottom of the barrel in our territories, not just in Chiapas or Mexico, but all over the world. And the Zapatistas use this image of what they call the capitalist hydra, which is a monster of many heads, to represent this phenomenon that we are living in right now. They also call this time that we're in the global storm, and I think we're all feeling it all around the world. We're living this global storm in different ways, depending where we are and who we are. But I think everyone's feeling it in one way or another. In Zapatista territory, and in Mexico in general, it's being experienced as an onslaught of mega projects. These large government-sponsored and supported projects that include industrial corridors of various kinds, such as the Interoceanic Corridor in the Isthmus, which is the narrowest part of Mexico. It's manifesting in massive deforestation of region. We see right now on the Yucatan Peninsula, where the badly called Maya train is being built, which is causing, of course, had a severe ecological impact. Also, has not been fully consulted with local communities, and it's largely a train destined for tourism, for massive tourism in the region, which will, of course, reconfigure, which would just bring in all sorts of other issues, but also for transporting other goods and services. It's not the only train or the only corridor or the only roads that are being built. Hundreds of mining concessions have been handed out over the past decades that are in different points of the process of mining, and these are very damaging, extractive types of mining to the land. Anyway, there is massive dispossession and displacement happening and in process of worsening, such as we're seeing in other parts of the world, you know, in its most extreme form, what we're seeing right now in Gaza. So it's this kind of mega projects happening all over the world, but in Mexico, these are the forms it's taking. Another head of the capitalist hydra, there are many heads, but is of course militarization, and that accompanies the mining and all the projects I just mentioned. Also monopolized mainstream media that controls the narratives about what is happening, and so not everybody is quite is hearing directly from the communities. People are hearing from state-sponsored media or a lot of monopolies. And there's a theater of governments that are composed of political parties that compete for power and attempt to placate or co-opt the people through social programs and handouts that amount to, you know, just crumbs for actual people, while the majority of tax monies go to, of course, economies of prisons and war. So all of this is part of a long history of colonial capitalist extraction and domination since 1492. It's not new. It's not just of the past decades, but over 500 years. Tomorrow, November 17th, we celebrate the 40th anniversary of the founding of the EZLN. So we're also, in this whole 500 years, it has also been a long history of resistance. And that is also what we celebrate. The Zapatistas in their current configuration are celebrating that 40th anniversary, but it's a much longer history. And on January 1st, 2024, that celebrates the 30th anniversary of the uprising, although as their latest communique reminds us, every day is a celebration because as they say, we are alive and we are in struggle.
Thank you for that phenomenal context and situating. And I'm thinking of one of their many very resonant slogans that has reverberated and inspired around the world, of one no and many yeses. And so in regards to what you shared, do we understand that slogan to be like this one unified, clear no to the violences of colonial capitalist globalization, and the many yeses being the different dimensions of autonomy that you were speaking of, and creating and cultivating different ways of being, different ways of living.
Yes, yes, definitely. The Zapatistas have always said that their way is not the way. They are just an example of what has worked for them. There are many ways of resisting, and each place, each people has to do it according to their histories, to their resources, to their means, to their modes, the modes of being, the way they do things. And also we are all learning how to be different. And so this caminando preguntando, walking while asking questions, is the methodology that they practice and promote, again with that caveat that that Zapatismo is not a recipe, it's a bridge. It's a bridge to get from here where we are to this better place, this better horizon of a world in which many worlds fit. That's another sort of saying of theirs.
Thank you. And I want to ask you to share a bit about your personal connection to the Zapatista movement, and how you have created this connection with the CIIS community, where you've led, I think, about half a dozen delegations since 2012. If you could speak to this, how did you come to be into this relationship?
You know, I was in Chiapas on January 1st, 1994 with my family, New Year's Day. My mother's a teacher, so we were there with families of the school where she was working at the time. And I knew, listened to it on the radio, and I knew this was big. I understood that this was a very big earthquake, without fully understanding what it all meant. It was something we all had to learn in the years and decades afterwards. So my path with learning about Zapatismo has been a slow learning by walking, by listening, over decades, really. And it wasn't till the late 90s and then into the 2000s that I came back to Chiapas specifically to seek out the movement. And then when I came to work at CIIS in 2007, by then I was living and working in Chiapas. There was such a strong desire to connect the two communities. I was in this alternative school in San Francisco, working at that time as an adjunct in this different way, this integral way, a way of connecting our different parts of ourselves, of trying to connect practice to theory, trying to connect all the parts of us that have been dismembered. And simultaneously, because I would travel back and forth between these localities, learning so much about how the Zapatistas were also trying to integrate so many things that have been disintegrated or dismembered historically for us. So, what arose was a desire to connect my communities, my community there, my community here. And that led to my organizing 5 or 6 study trips between, I think it was 2012 and 2018, that were composed of students, faculty, staff, and we participated in different events, the little school, La Escuelita, the little school of freedom, according to the Zapatistas, which was a very radical project of immersion in daily life with Zapatista families. We attended 2 different conciencias para la humanidad, which translates into the with sciences, or sciences with a conscience for humanity. as well as compartes, which is a play on words between compañero, compa, and art. So these are places where we shared arts, and these are ongoing. There's some that happen in Oakland every year. And then, of course, when I was living there were the weekly seminars at the Indigenous Center of Integral Capacitation that you mentioned at the beginning, that was our host institution in many ways and facilitated many of these encounters and events, or other larger seminars such as that as the Critical Thought Against the Capitalist Hydra, and many other festivals, seminars, conferences, talks that would happen continuously at this Indigenous Center of Integral Capacitation that is known as CIIS by its acronym. And for many of the participants on these study trips, delegations to Chiapas, I mean, the experience really changed them profoundly and came to influence their own lives, their work, and organizing. I've run into former students recently, actually in Albuquerque at a Zapatista encuentro there, and it brought me a lot of joy to see what they're doing, what students have, how they've taken these learnings into their own lives in different kinds of work, in different kinds of care work, organizing work, political work, NGO work, whatever kind of work that they do in the world, but carrying some of the principles and experiences from those trips.
I love the play on words with conciencias. I would love to ask you about your research and what your focus on what you term Zapatista Seed Pedagogics, and to move into some kind of key concepts and themes here. And so just first of all, what is the difference between pedagogy and pedagogics, which is not a term we hear as often, right? Whereas pedagogy is method and practice of teaching. I'm curious to ask about that choice of that term. And what is the significance of the seed? And so.
Yeah, I started out.
Yeah.
I started out with this notion of pedagogy of the seed, and then realized in working through the research and the theorization that I was doing that this other word was more appropriate, and this word is pedagogics, which is a mouthful, and it's not a common word that we use, and it's translated from the Spanish pedagogica, and it's borrowed from the Argentinian Mexican philosopher Enrique Dussel, who used this word in his what he calls a pedagogics of liberation. And what this word describes is a broader field of philosophy that includes politics, ethics, economics, and other realms of knowledge. It's a more holistic way of understanding education and what education does, that it's not just this banking method, to use Paulo Freire's term, of transmitting knowledge from one head to another, but a much more complex terrain of exchange, of learning, what I call a co-education. So I'm indebted to Maestro Enrique Dussel, who just passed away last week, actually, for this word and for his tremendous, amount of work. He was a big supporter of the movement, and was the only time I've seen a philosopher on television, on the news in Mexico, on Carmen Aristegui's program. He was very beloved by the people. He was definitely a philosopher from below, a philosopher with people's movements. So that is where that word came, and I realized that this was a word that better described what I was trying to theorize from education, and from an education not just in Zapatista communities, but this broader education that Zapatismo was teaching us outside of the autonomous communities. And that was the impetus for my research, is I wanted to understand what was happening to us outside And then I chose the seed, calling it a seed pedagogics, because of what it's doing. Well, first of all, in that it's a very compact technology. The way a seed is a very compact technology, and an ancient, maybe one of the oldest technologies of life, and how it contains such potency, right? And such in this very compact way. And so it seemed to me an apt metaphor, but also it's not just that, it's also describes what the Zapatistas are doing by sharing their process, by sharing their learning, and by sharing of their autonomy. They're sharing their learning with others, in their communities, creation, daily practice of autonomy, but also they're sharing it with us outside through these internationalist encounters, both in their autonomous territories, but also in traveling to other countries, like they did in the summer of 2021 with their Journey for Life, where they explicitly stated before departing from their communities that they were carrying seeds, that they were carrying the seeds of their autonomy, of their history, of their process, to share with the Europe from below. I'll just pause here to explain for a minute that it started out, the Journey for Life, it started with a boat called La Montaña, the mountain. And this was a boat that carried a delegation of seven people from a reverse colonization route from Mexico to Europe in a boat, and to carry their seeds and share with the Europe from below, a Europe that was renamed by Mari Jose, one of the participants on this journey. She renamed Europe Sumilkashenkop, which means in her language, which is Tojolabal, insubordinate Europe. And in order to convey that they were not here to conquer or subjugate the way had happened over 500 years ago, but they were there to connect with the Europe from below, which also suffers from the capitalist hydra and in this global storm.
Zapatista Seed Pedagogics is in large part a decolonizing educational process. And so I would like to ask if you could speak to, decolonizing and decolonization is a term that gets used a lot in a lot of different ways. And so what in this context, what are we talking about in terms of different layers of what is being decolonized? What do they mean by that? What is their focus? Decolonizing education.
Yeah, it's a term, as you say, that needs to be unpacked and means different things to different people in different places. But I think the Zapatista Seed Pedagogics is largely a decolonizing educational process because it includes so many components of what is needed when we speak of decolonizing ourselves. I mean, starting with the recuperation of land. So this notion of first and firstmost land back, right? That there's been this history of dispossession of people's territories, land and territories, and I say it twice in this way because in Mexico we speak of both land and the territory. The land is not just that place of earth. The land includes the territory, and the territory is all of the things that make it possible to live, which of course includes all of the beings in that territory, but it also includes things like ways of life, rituals, the sacred, spirituality, and even our dead. So when I say the reclaiming of the land and the territory, it is bigger than just a parcel that is delineated in a certain way, which is the way in many times in English, we think of land and territory, but that's not, so part of it is to decolonize what we mean by land and territory. And starting with giving land back, land reclamation. So for the Zapatistas, that was 1994, this recuperation, and they refer to it in those terms, the recuperation of lands that are now under their autonomous control. But of course, it is so much deeper, and I mean, it goes beyond. Like all of this is not so much beyond, but is contained within these concepts. Are so many things that have been impacted by colonization. So, you know, challenging the nature-human divide as if we were not nature, right? Like all these ways of thinking that came with colonialization that divided and separated and dismembered life itself from all our components. So challenging this notion of the individual, challenging, a reverence for life, you know, that life is integrated, that life is not divisible in these atomistic ways.
Right.
And also for the Zapatistas, this really started with the eradication of shame. This notion that that being who you are is shameful, you know, whether it's because you're indigenous, because you're a woman, because you're of another gender. Unlearning colonial shame was the thing that the parents of the children asked for when they said, what should the children be learning in the new autonomous education? So unlearning all these internalized ideologies over time, and the practices that encourage collectivity, unlearning individualism, reclaiming ancestral ways of knowing, being, doing, which include ways of making food and medicine and being in relation with the sacred, other beings, our rituals, our language, all the things that make us who we are, in, you know, anywhere in the world, but definitely in this context. So all of those are the forms of decolonization, and of course it goes on, and we could talk about it a long time. But this is I think part of what the Zapatistas mean with their pedagogics and decolonizing process that it is.
Yeah, thank you. Could you say a little bit more about what challenging the human nature binary looks like in practice in terms of embodying interbeing and interdependence?
A little bit, sure. I mean, the relationship with other beings, a lot of it's contained in the language. And this is true of indigenous languages, I think, all over the world. But one of the things that I love about learning some of the native languages of the Maya territory is to learn how the language itself contains other ways of thinking of us as is in the language. It's in the termination of the words, so that everything is always ending with a tik, which is communicating the usness, and also that almost all things that perhaps in English we would call objects or are animate. That the world is animate even in things that we make, or you know, a bowl that we make from the earth. It's still animate. It still has a soul, in a sense. It still has its being. And in some of the languages, you say, if you say a bowl fell off the table, it's because the bowl ran off the table. You know, things are alive. The world is alive, and not just stones are alive. So there's just a whole nother way of seeing the world. It's not a thing or composed of things for you to use for your personal benefit, but rather it's an interrelation of beings with which you interact and engage and are in relationship with, and therefore you have respect and responsibility towards all of these beings. You start to not see them so much as things in the world, but more as fellow beings. So this is part of what is contained in the stories and in the and in the rituals of not just the Maya, but many indigenous peoples around the world.
Thank you. When you were sharing about the historic context of resistance continuing to the present, how would you say that the Zapatista movement now is practicing forms of resistance to ongoing extraction, ongoing oppression at the hands of the state? What does this look like today?
Well, in their daily construction of autonomy, I mean, it is a daily practice of figuring out how we're going to solve problems, you know, how we're going to face the increasing militarization of the state, of what we're going to do about these rival drug cartels that have infiltrated the region in these last years in a very intensified way that we had not seen before. So how are we going to face these new challenges and the old challenges? How are we going to grow enough food? You know, so all of the how do we solve our collective problems? And this is a collective society, so we approach the problems with collectivity. I mean, that is a way the movement practices these forms of resistance. And of course, as they're always telling us, always in their communiques, they're saying, organize yourselves, organize yourselves, organize yourselves. Like there's nothing without organization, without the discipline of listening to each other, of gathering and being together, forming trust, building trust, relationship with each other, listening to each other, and speaking your word in assembly. Assembly is a ancestral practice that has been that is politicized in Zapatismo, practiced by many communities. But in Zapatismo, all of these practices that are not unique to Zapatismo, they exist in other indigenous communities, are politicized in a particular way. So drawing from these ancestral cosmologies and practices and rituals and ways of being and doing in everyday life, you know, making your tortillas from your corn, you know, being with your children, things that are just basic things of life, seeing them as part of the resistance.
And in the spirit of collectivity, I want to lift up this beautiful term and concept of corazón nosotros, which is the title of one of your essays. What is the significance of corazón nosotros in this context?
Yeah, I love
us in our contexts. Yeah.
It means collective heart, corazón nosotros. It's our collective beating heart, right? And the Zapatistas make reference to this. It's a term that recognizes that we are in fact not isolated, atomized individuals as capitalism would have us believe, but rather that we are a wide diversity of beings, including us humans, but all of us, human and beyond human, that we are all connected in a web of life, in this web of relationships and responsibilities to each other, so that this collectively beating heart, it speaks to the construction of an us, of a we that we need to do, or if we're not already doing it. and it's of what we hold in common, that we are beings like any other being on this earth, whose birthright is a dignified life with the purpose of living in the ways that support our flourishing, our mutual flourishing. Just like any flower in the garden is part of a stalk, is part of the leaves, is part of the roofs, is part of the plant, is part of the soil. I mean, it's all interconnected. Just like that, we are too. It may not be obvious to some of us because we've been taught otherwise, but that we are not separate, that we are actually very entangled with the rest of creation.
I really appreciate this metaphor of the flowers in the garden, right, that are each blossoming in their own fabulous way while having these deep roots and connection to this larger ecosystem, in terms of thinking of that relationship between individual expression and agency and growth and the collective and corazón nosotrico. And I'm curious, I mean, there's another binary there of like the individual and the collective, the me and the we, and curious to ask what are some of the challenges that you see of translating some of these collectivist values and ways of being into our very hyper-individualistic society and culture?
It's a great question. And I feel like I myself fell into this trap at some point along the way, you know, where it was, you know, the collective, not the individual, and as if these were like two binary, dichotomized, you know, things. But understanding, you know, that one's own personal self is not subsumed in this collectivity that we're talking about here in Zapatismo, that each person is precious, you know, is a precious name and comes from a precious place. So it's not about being subsumed into some kind of faceless revolution, which is what so much of this like fear and around this notion of communism evokes in the general American public. It's not that. It's not to erase our individual personhood. So it's not, it warns us not to fall into this binary or false dichotomy trap that posits it as me or we, but rather me in the we.
Thank you. I want to read a brief passage from one of your essays of thinking about the central symbol of the Caracol, which is a very multi-dimensional, multi-layered symbol. And you write that Zapatista Seed Pedagogics teach and practice interbeing and interdependence with community, including the natural world and cosmos, stretching from microscopic to vast scales. This is often represented through the image and motion of a spiral conch shell, a caracol, such as those of snails and other mollusks. And the spiral of this caracol is a paradigm of symbolic thought for Mayan peoples, where the caracol is a concept that transcends and encircles the words used to describe it. So there's so much here contained within the symbol of the caracol. Could you speak to its significance? Yeah, its different contexts of significance.
I'll try briefly because I know we don't have much time left, but
we have a fair amount of time.
Okay.
I just want to say that I just heard thunder here in the Bay Area and saw lightning, so we're just being joined by a storm.
Nice. Welcome, thunder. Well, the snail, or the spiral of the snail, has so many multiple meanings in Zapatismo. I mean, the conch shell is used to call the community to assembly. I mean, it is a gathering of the people to come together to do our collective work. It is also a glyph in a lot of Mesoamerican codexes. You see this snail conch-like glyph coming out of people's mouths. So it's also a symbol for word, speaking. And so and then the spiral itself is also a way of describing time. you know, that time is not linear. It spirals, like we are here again, but we are in a slightly different place. If you imagine the spiral in a 3D space, you are in a similar location, but you are actually in another dimension of it. So it's very rich. The Zapatistas used this symbolism, notion, and word of the Caracol to name their centers, their administrative localities in their autonomous territory, where they would gather for encuentros, but also receive and engage with outsiders. So caracoles also became these windows to the world and ways of welcoming and doorways into Zapatista territories. So, I mean, these are just, you know, briefly stated some of the ways in which that symbol and figure of the snail or the conch shell signify in Zapatismo. And I guess the obvious one, but it needs to be said, is that the snail moves slowly.
I was just thinking cyclical
So
time and slow time.
You'll see a lot of snails, you know, and they also symbolize, you know, moving slowly, and that real deep change takes time, that we should move at the pace of the slowest and just slow down, which is so relevant in our very fast-paced world now. So very rich significance and wisdom that the snail and the spiral and all of these symbolisms around the Caracol carry for the movement and for us as learners.
And the slow politics wisdom of the snail seems very much present in what you were mentioning earlier of the caminamos preguntando, of the like walking, we ask questions, that this is not this quick recipe, prescription, figure it out in the face of tremendous urgency, but that it's taking the time things take to doubt and to question, and making that path through traveling it. And so I'd like to ask about how, a bit more, I mean, you've already spoken to this in a number of ways, but how can Zapatista Seed Pedagogics inform ongoing struggles for freedom through our personal and collective practices and daily practices?
Yeah, I like to think of this as seeding at home, or how to bring this home into our context and our lives. We did touch upon unlearning. I think there's so much unlearning for us to do. And just when we think we've learned it, we've got to like unlearn it again or learn it in another way. And a lot of that has to do with listening and tending to those voices that have been subjugated and continue to be subjugated. So that's listening to elders, to children, to, of course, the non-human world, to plants, birds, trees, animals, the forests, the waterways, oceans, the stones. Like it's revolutionary. It's to do that in a world that doesn't think that has merit or is possible. So that's this unlearning and listening were some of the seeds that came out of my research when I asked people, you know, what did you learn and how are you applying this in your own worlds? And so this was part of what I learned through doing the research, was that people were in this, again, spiral process of being there in the same place again, but a little further along in the unlearning, and then practicing, you know, that it's not just theoretical, it's in our daily practices, how to build collectivity, how do we build commonality, how do we build this community in commonness. So practices of making decisions collectively as a family, as a block in your neighborhood, as in whatever collectivity you belong to at work, in different ways, how to listen and how to make sure that everyone's listened to and is able to speak, given their particular context. You know, how to connect to the peoples who have been there all along, caretaking the land and territory. How to connect, as was suggested at the beginning of in the introduction, to our local indigenous movements, and listen to the women who have been not heard as much as the men. So nurturing these practices of collectivity takes many forms: collective work, which we call tequio in Spanish, but also collective celebration. The fiesta is a very important part of collective resistance. Sharing our resources, sharing whatever plots of land we can offer for gardening with friends and neighbors, caring for each other when we're sick, when we're all the ways that we were challenged to care for each other during COVID, but also since, well, we're still in COVID. You know, in getting to know each other, because we don't know each other a lot of the time. We don't know the creatures of the lands we inhabit, getting to know the histories. So all of this.
Beautiful. And you also mentioned, right, in this spirit, in terms of practices, just of the role of politicized memory and the Zapatistas' nurturing of long historical memory, and what you were also just speaking to in terms of this listening, learning intergenerationally, and nurturing long historical memory in our society, which is so invested in forms of amnesia, is itself ongoing revolutionary practice. And so we're nearing the end of our time, and I'd like to invite another story sharing.
Yeah, I'd love to close and with a very brief recap of, it's a story fragment of a recent communique from the Zapatistas, just released in the last few weeks. And in it, they tell the story of the first gods, which I alluded to at the beginning. And they're stumbling around in the dark because the lights have been lost. And so they're stumbling in the dark, trying to figure out what to do. And so they call us humans together to gather with them and to hold an assembly together. And so there's all this funny storytelling that you can all read for yourselves in the communique about, you know, how they're tripping over each other and injuring themselves, going through the brush, you know, getting scars and getting all scratched up. But they finally do sit together in the dark, in first in silence, and then listening to each other. And how little by little people start to speak and offer ideas. And so the lesson of the story is really about forging this path forward together in the dark, figuring out what happened to the light, how did it get lost, what are we going to do to bring it back, and I'll just read a little tiny bit of it just so you can hear the cadence from the communique itself. Ixmucane, who is the mother goddess, gathered the men, women, and otroas of corn, that is, us humans, who come in many colors, and everyone has their own way. There were no religions, no nations, no states, no political parties, nor everything that was later born as seeds of war. And then Ixmucane said, "Come, little siblings," and guided by her voice, all the men and women arrived, with the otroas too, because they did not feel excluded. So they met in an assembly. They didn't look at each other because there was no light, but they could talk and listen to each other. Ixmucane asked them, "What are we going to do?" The men, women, and otroas did not look at each other because there was no light, but remained silent until a voice said, "Well, you tell us what we're going to do." Applause was not seen, but it was clearly heard. Ixmucane laughed heartily and said, "Do you think I know? We don't know as it is, but maybe maybe gathered together in an assembly and talking, suddenly some ideas emerge about what we're going to do. They were all silent, wondering what they were going to do. Many ideas and words were said, and they no longer fit in Ishmukane's head. So she began to keep them in her hair, and her hair became long. That's why women sometimes have long hair. But then it wasn't enough either, because she adjusted her hair, and that's when the hair press was invented, which, as its name indicates, means grab ideas. Ishmukane's hair was already reaching the ground, continued speaking ideas and words. And then Ishmukane began to keep her ideas in the wounds that she had gotten when she fell against thorns and vines. She had wounds everywhere. On her face, her arms, her hands, her legs, her entire body was full of wounds, so she was able to save everything. That's why they say that old people, that is sensible people, who have many wrinkles and scars, means they have many ideas and stories. That is to say, they know a lot. Later on, I will tell you what they agreed on in that first assembly that took place in the House of Beans. But in this one, I will tell you what Ishmukane said. Well, we already have, as it were, a plan to face this problem that we have. Since the world is just being born and we are given a name to each thing so as not to confuse ourselves, we are going to call this thing we did in common, because we all participated. Some giving ideas, others proposing other ideas, and then there are those who speak and there are those who keep notes of what is said. There was silence first. Heavy, strong was the silence. Then you could hear someone start to applaud, then another. And then everyone applauded and you could hear that they were very happy. And they didn't dance because they couldn't see anything at all, but they laughed a lot because they'd found a new word called in common, which means to seek the path together. And it was not that the first gods invented it, those who created the world, but it came to be that it was the men, women, and otroas made of corn who in common found the word that is the way. And it goes on, but this is just a small fragment from the mountains of the Mexican Southeast.
What a potent closing. Thank you so much. It is a profound joy and honor to hear these perspectives and lineages. And thank you so much just for your incredible synthesis and sharing. We are able to move into questions from people who are listening right now. And so I will share these aloud. One question is from someone who is in Chiapas, saying, I understand many Zapatistas have left the movement, and I understand life is difficult and dangerous. Can these decreasing numbers be confirmed, and how serious is this for the future of the movement?
Thank you for that question. Yeah, it is true that there are many circumstances that sometimes mean that people are not identified as Zapatistas anymore. And I'll explain a little bit what that means. To be a Zapatista, and when I say that, I mean in the community-based way. So these are, in order to be a Zapatista, you cannot receive government aid, like no government aid. That is a very strict rule. I mean, there's other ones too, like no alcohol or drugs. So it sometimes does come to pass, or sometimes migrating is another, reason why you can't participate in collective life in Zapatista communities. So there are all sorts of reasons like this of why some people may leave the movement, not in their hearts, but in the necessity of the moment. Sometimes it might be because you need to accept that money for medicine for your child. And sometimes, desperate circumstances of different kinds that force us to migrate. And also, I think one of the things that was hinted at in the question or said was that the violence has become increased with the presence of the cartels. So it is not possible for me to confirm numbers or how many Zapatistas are leaving. I mean, it is something that happens, and it is also something that happens that they are welcomed back into the community when the circumstances change, whether that's migration or the situations that forced a different relationship to the government for that moment. So it is a wave, a sort of an ocean of movement of whether you are considered a Zapatista or not. And I think that many people who perhaps are not technically Zapatistas are still practicing Zapatismo in some way in their life, are continuing to uphold the principles and continue to, have their allegiance with the movement. But these are things that I can't confirm. We can't confirm numbers or exactly, how it is happening where.
A question from someone named Michael is asking, what is the relationship between the Zapatista movement and the movement of the Kurdish people? For example, are there other related movements springing up, for example, that are women-centric, autonomous, mutual aid and cooperative, or Marxist anarchist groups?
That's a great question. Yeah, as I mentioned before, from the beginning, there's been a great internationalist presence and interaction with other movements around the world, including the Kurdish movement in Rojava. Certainly, there's been exchange with representatives from the movement in San Cristobal. I've been there several times when that's happened. At the women's encuentros, many other peoples were there from all over representing different movements. And I think the women's encuentros were like a big step in recognizing the importance of those connections. Part of what my work is about, and I invite all of you to read some of my articles that are about my research, are about how this is a co-education between the movements, that when the people of the different movements come together, it's not just a one-way learning that happens, but the women's encuentros illustrated how, from the first to the second, how there was definitely a listening and some changes in how the second one was done based on some of the learnings from the first. For example, the inclusion of like who qualified as a woman that could attend the women's encuentro. That was left up to the person to decide. So that trans women were welcome, anybody who felt that their experience as a feminized body fit into the category. There was nobody arguing the category with you. It was very much left to that autonomy, that self-naming of the participants, of the people who attended. And I noted that and thought how beautiful, here is this learning, this co-learning, co-education happening between peoples, between these movements in the span of just this 1 year, because the encuentros were very close together in time. So I think that these are very fertile encounters, and there is a lot of mutual fertilization happening, of seeding of different ideas, of expansion of vocabularies, languages being exchanged, new words being learned and created, which is something that I've been particularly interested in recently, and in forming lexicons of that not only rescue perhaps words that have fallen into disuse or words that are not understood in their full significance by newer generations, and that we need the elders to explain why those words and concepts were fought for. And then also perhaps there are new words that need to be created. And so the creating of new language, language that is particular to our contexts, times, and places, but then also language that we can hold in common. So these are all exciting developments that come out of these different encounters. And even when we are separated from each other, you know, with COVID or violence, that these encounters are able to happen in other ways and do happen in other ways.
A question from Aton is, how can those of us in other parts of colonized Turtle Island contribute to the solution, development process, to issues being faced by the Zapatista communities, especially those issues that also affect us in our respective locations, such as the Southeast United States?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Aton. The Zapatistas always said, please go back to your places and organize where you are. That's how you help us. You help us by engaging in your struggle, you know, being connected to ours, learning with each other, but please, you know, organize where you are and make that change where you are in every day, every single day. So the invitation, I think, is to create both autonomy and solidarity. These are not dichotomized principles. Autonomy and solidarity are intertwined with each other and very much a part of what the Zapatistas have been doing all along and continue to encourage us to do, building mutual solidarities, mutual aid, mutual things in common, while also developing each community, each of us in our own places and according to our traditions and according to our ways and according to our calendars and geographies, because it's all different depending on where you are, how we go about creating this thing that we call autonomy, how we go about creating our dignified forms of life, our self-determination, relying on our own communities for healing, for justice, for governance, for education. Like, how can we do this ourselves? Feel powerful enough to do it ourselves and not rely on governments or forces above to tell us what to do or how to heal, or be at their mercy with systems that just don't work for us. So those are some suggestions.
The big question. A question from Hasmi is, how can different anti-apartheid and anti-colonial movements around the world incorporate Zapatista frameworks to prevent the more authoritarian type of anti-imperialist?
This is such a good question. Oof. Yeah, we fall into these traps, right, with this notion of anti-imperialism being narrowly defined. And I think that many anti-apartheid and anti-colonial movements around the world would do well to consider and find their own way of expressing and articulating this image, this concept, this framework of the Zapatistas, of the capitalist hydra, of the global storm, that this is a larger systemic conglomeration of forces that are oppressing us all, right? So that we understand that it as more of a from above and a resistance from below. And this will help us connect to each other and gain force, instead of seeing these the problem or the oppressor in one particular location or oppressor. Certainly they all play a role, but understanding it in this broader framework is important. So that's one part I think of what you're getting at in your question, but also this authoritarianism that you point to is really key too, because we cannot cure the disease with the same prescription of authoritative types of ways of being, right? And this is something we all tend to fall into these traps because this is what we learned, right? We learned authority. This is what was taught to us in our systems, and we continue to hear this law and order and authority, and who has the authority and who doesn't. But coming to understand that the true authority is below. I highly encourage everybody here to read, and it's translated into many languages, the most recent communiques, because in them, the Zapatistas talk about the pyramid structure. And I think this gets to the core of this question, and talk about it historically and across the world, in how so many so-called civilizations or peoples around the world, you know, the victors have raised up or extolled past the defeated or the conquered peoples for things like their pyramids, their archaeological wonders, you know, the repositories, the places that are somehow connote the grandeur of the rulers, but don't tell us the stories of who built these pyramids, the laborers, the artisans, all the workers who built all these structures that we now marvel at. And he asks in the communique, this is, I think, Moises, says, and where did the workers go after they completed the Great Wall of China? You know, where are their story? And these are the people who we need to look to, you know, in our societies for this leading by obeying. I mean, this is the collective in common. And so he proposes the inverting of the pyramid. And they present their new structure because the Zapatistas have just undergone a 3-year process of consultation. And they say they've been thinking about it for even longer, of restructuring their autonomy and the way they function. And so they have inverted the pyramids so that the people making the decisions are the wide base, are the communities themselves. And they go into detail, and they have diagrams and everything. So you can look this all up. But I found it very powerful, you know, because often as colonized peoples, we revert to the past in this grandeur way, when we were kings and queens, when we, you know, our civilizations, you know, we built temples, we were, you know, there's this way of aggrandizing the past through the rulers, through the excesses, instead of through the workers, the everyday people, and the everyday crafts and making and being and forms of just everyday life and people. So I was very grateful to this last communique that talks about this inverting of the pyramid, because we have to think of power in terms of the potency that we all hold as beings, not just humans, but all of us. The potency of the seed, right? That has the power to create life. That is our true power, you know, not this subjugation from above in this pyramid where only a few get to do that and squash the rest of us down. But our power as the wide base of the pyramid inverted. That's very exciting for me to read that and talk about theorization. Find a movement theorizing where the true potency of life is in this inverted pyramid that is in some way, maybe it's also another way of thinking of the seed. So that is a lesson, that is some deep learning for all of us to read and absorb and incorporate in our bodies, to embody in our everyday life and practice with each other. Not easy, and I'm sure it will take many generations, but I think it is possible.
I want to also add that in your writing, you talk about humility, practices of humility and learning to listen as foundational, which are such antidotes to these authoritarian tendencies. Do you want to say anything there about just how like humility and deep listening are structured or woven into daily practice?
Yeah, humility, it's so interesting because we're taught, in some ways, the dominant ideology teaches us that, to be humble or humility is somehow something akin to defeat, or it is something lesser and lower. And it is Zapatismo that really helped me, again, invert that pyramid and understand that there is huge power in humility, in really being able to listen, in really being able to, it's a form of love, really, where you really are able to, listen to the other in a way that even when they make a mistake, you also see your own role in it. And it's very deep. I think I'm only beginning to understand it in the ways that I think that Zapatismo is offering it to us. But I know that it's not easy, and that none of us are practiced at it, that it takes a lot of practice and patience, and how to not let our egos get the best of us, which they inevitably do. How can we trust ourselves and each other more to make room, to make room in the relationship for that subjugated place in me, in you. And this is where Enrique Dussels' pedagogics are very helpful, because he has some beautiful concrete examples of how that happens in the teaching relationship, in this case with a child, but very much like how you make room for the not knowing, and for not needing to be right. If you are parting from that place of knowing and certitude, that because you are certain that it is this way and you know the truth, then there is no longer that space for anything else to emerge. So remaining more in the non-knowing and openness to truly listening. It's very difficult. I mean, this is something that we encounter, we stumble in our daily lives and in our movements all the time. So we have a lot to learn yet.
Indeed. Our final closing question is about resources, of where to go from here. How could folks learn more? If you have suggestions around books, podcasts, suggestions for resources to gain a deeper understanding of Zapatista ideology and teachings. And it sounds like one would be what you were mentioning of the Enlace, Zapatista and the communiques, which people can read in many languages. Where could people find those? Yeah,
that's for the direct communiques that are coming from the movement. It's called Enlace, ENLACE, Zapatista. And you can Google it and you'll find these are direct communiques, stories, and they cover 30 years worth. So there's a lot of them. And they build on each other. And so, it definitely takes work, and it's best done collectively with others to get the collective knowledge in the works and going. there's a vast literature on Zapatismo, all sorts of people have written a ton of stuff on them. So, getting into a library and really digging into that vast literature but can be overwhelming because there is so much of it. I think that joining up with Zapatista groups in your community or in your locality. In the US, there's also a binational Zapatista network called Red Sexta Grietas del Norte, which is a network of cracks. Grietas translates into cracks. Grietas is Grietas of the North. And this is a website that you can connect to. There's resources there and a growing resource list. And also they organize various encuentros nationally. Just had one in Albuquerque, New Mexico back in September. And so there's opportunities also for gathering in the flesh and exchanging how the global storm is affecting you and your communities and how different communities are organizing around it. And if you're, of course, in San Cristobal, there's the space called Sendas that is recent, but and also I think seminarios are being organized more ad hoc. The ones that used to be at CIIS are now happening, I think, at Sendas. So that's a space to tune into. And also to acknowledge that Zapatista philosophy is a politicization of other. There's so many other autonomous movements happening in Mexico and the world. And so, these are also important to learn from. I mean, Cherán in Michoacán, just to name one, the movements in Oaxaca of the different peoples of Oaxaca, tremendous work is being done in the Isthmus region. So Guerrero is another. I mean, in all geographies, I feel that there are rumblings of rebellion if not already long established. So connecting to others, reaching out and connecting to any of these networks, resources, websites, and learning with others, I think is really important because there's only so much we can understand on our own. I am always humbled at how much better I understand things when I'm doing it collectively. I just need the perspective of the other. So it's and it also is funner, much more fun. So I encourage you to reach out to me, to Grietas, to Enlace, to Sendas, to whatever is easiest for you, and continue learning and also nourishing us with your own perspective and your own knowledges.
And for earlier when you were speaking about Indigenous solidarity and relationship, and particularly here in the San Francisco Bay Area, were there organizations that you wanted to lift up?
Yes, thank you, Zara. Yeah, I mentioned it earlier that amongst the many things we can do to decolonize ourselves, and there's listening and learning and unlearning, is to connect to the beings that have been here a long time, human and non-human, including the Indigenous communities that have tended and cared for these lands. And that includes many organizations. I mean, here well, I'm currently in Chochenyo territory, where Sogoreate is an organization that is active here and reclaiming land and working on Indigenous resurgence in the East Bay, but also over on the peninsula, Ramaytush. There are two Ramaytush organizations, the Association of Ramaytush Ohlone, but also the Muchiate Indigenous Land Trust is women-led and doing teaching me the new word for San Francisco, which is different from what was said in the introduction. So I encourage you to look up their website and learn it for yourself. Kata Gomes is the one of the people spearheading that effort and doing incredible work in Indigenous resurgence, but especially of the Ramaytush language. So I definitely wanted to point your attention their way and to support and engage with them in however you can.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you, Zara. It's been such a pleasure to collaborate with you on this conversation and just the joy of sharing.
Absolutely. And thank you to public programs, everyone who makes this possible. And thank you to everyone who showed up tonight. And thank you for your wonderful presence and questions.
Thank you, everyone.